All right, let's take a look at some logos and talk a little bit about what makes some of these things work and maybe what some things don't work so well. Some ways that you might think about approaching logo design. First thing you could do perhaps is, maybe use your initials. And initials are, always a good option, right? And ampersand, or some other graphic symbol. Then your whole name maybe underneath here, maybe a graphical element separating the two, something like that, okay? Here's another example of the same sort of idea with a little ampersand sort of tucked into the notch in between the A and the M. Your name could go underneath here. It could be a little symbol here. It could have a little bit of a boundary around the perimeter. Here's another idea where you might be able to use your first name inside of a graphical shape and then your last name, or vice versa. One name could be larger and the other one could be smaller. You could consider opportunities for things like ligatures, like we see here. You might look at this very carefully. Notice that there's been some very careful thought to how the shapes interact, right? And we have a little shape over here. This rounded shape, as it comes in between the end of the serif of the D and the L, indicates there could be a dot there. So there's some interesting graphical things from very tight kerning, right? We talked about that in the last project. So some opportunities exist in that kind of thing. Something else you might consider, possibly creating a simple mark for yourself, and then maybe a change in type between the beginning, the first name and the last name. Could be, noticing here there's a little graphical shape inside of the A. Something you might consider there. Graphical elements between your first and your last name. Some possibilities there. Here's an example of using a font, a very light font with a very, very bold-faced variation of that font. So that's something you might consider. Same kind of idea here, except that they've done a little graphical a mark again. So that's something you might consider. Here's an example of creating a slightly more complex graphical shape. The type is set on top. Opportunities exist for spacing, letter spacing, word spacing, and spacing above and below the shape. Here's an example of using, not that this is a great example, mind you, but it's still an example of using initial, what's the word I'm looking for, the first letters of every word as an acronym, and then adding a graphic shape. So if your first initial of your first name, middle name, and last name creates something cool, that's an option for you. Here's a rather elaborate example of creating a graphical shapes that are more elaborate, and then using fonts that are somewhat in character with the overall sort of Art Deco design. Here's an example of using a serif font and a serif font, but one is a little bit elaborate with this little highlight area, and one's a little more elegant and simple. Okay. Here's an example of using a graphical shape with a font that has a very specific characteristic. In other words, this is a very bold font with very strong strokes. It's sans serif, and then they're attempting to imitate or to mirror the thickness of those strokes in these graphical elements here. So it, and of course it's the bottom part of the British flag as well, but the idea is that they're trying to mirror the effect or the feeling of the font with the graphic shape. Here's something along the lines of what happens inside of that, using the logo in your name, using a simple graphical shape and then putting some text inside of that and then reversing it out. That could be a first name, a last name. Notice that there's a little bleed here, and so that creates some energy for the negative area to move into the letter forms, and it creates a little bit more of an energetic feel to it. They've adapted the font a little bit in this case here. They've removed the crosshair because it doesn't need one based on the letter forms that are there. This is a good example of using letter forms and using a font that that brings out the best characteristics of those letter forms. We'll take a look at that a little bit in a minute. Here's an example of two very graphical shapes interspersed. This could be a first initial and a last initial, so there's some options there. Here's a good example of a font, and it's a very elegant font, and well, I would say it's very elegant, but it's pretty elegant, and it's got some fairly wide kerning, letter spacing. Notice this little spot right here. I've often wondered why they just didn't combine those two letter forms, why they left that little teeny gap in there. It's been something that's bugged me forever, but someone obviously made that decision. But when you're using a font, keep in mind the characteristics of that font and what it can do. We played around a lot with that in the last project, so I'd expect you to continue with that thought process as you move into this project as well. Here's a really great example of using a font that takes advantage of the letter forms that are in the word. All around circular forms really lend themselves well to a font like this, so be particularly sensitive to when you are doing something with your name. If there are certain letter forms that look good in a certain font or that exemplify a certain sort of characteristic, you might consider capitalizing on that and trying to make it work a little more effectively. Okay, here is an example of using a very contrasty font relationship. We've got a very bold script font up against an italic courier style font, and then a very simple, elegant, I wouldn't say elegant's the word, I would say a very simple, clean sans serif font for the group de la Poste, and then of course carrying through on a graphic shape. So I'm not saying it's a great design, but it's an idea that you might consider. In other words, putting in graphical shapes and then having them interact in some way with the letter forms. This is just an example of a font that was designed specifically for a specific use right here, and it probably never went any further than this, and sometimes you have to do that. If you are trying to design something and you just can't find the font that does what you want it to do, you might just have to go ahead and make a font yourself. This is another example of that, where they used the designed font that played off of the feeling that they wanted to have with this sort of edgy kind of angular thing. This, I think, did becoming its own font, and very often you'll find that font designs started with a logo design and then went from there. Here's a logo that's been around forever, and it's really timeless. And if you really study this, it's very well done. There's of course a lot of overlap, right? And the way the overlap shapes work brings our eye from one place to another. There's a lot of ligatures in here, right? This is when letter forms attach because they make sense to. I mean, somebody gave a lot of thought to that little curve on the bottom of the I and how it goes in with the F. And you know, the fact that it is a script, of course, is something that's you can consider that, but there's things that are happening within this that would not happen in a normal script font. They were designed specifically for this particular situation. But just the way everything works together, large initial caps, that's something you should always keep in mind as an option. You can do a lot of neat things with initial caps, especially if your first initial is a fun letter like an S or an A or something like that. Here's a good example of where a font was either incredibly adapted. It probably was an existing font that they did a lot of work to get it to do what they needed it to do. Of course, the O, right, becomes the dolphin with the waves, and the W's been altered to create a wave form. You know, so that's kind of neat. The E and the A are combined. The S, the bottom of the S is mirroring the top of the W. So they've done some work to adapt this letter form, the letter forms of this font, to make it work for this particular logo. So that's something you might consider as well. Just because the font looks like that doesn't mean it has to stay like that. You can certainly play around with things and experiment with altering those letter forms. An example here of adding a graphic as part of a letter form. In this font, I think, actually did end up becoming a font, although it was designed specifically for Sector at the time. And so consider that there might be opportunities for you to include graphical shapes within letter forms. Here's a situation where, of course, they're master lock, and they're trying to make everything look like a lock, with the O and the C and so on. And it has this very heavy, very secure kind of feel to it. So the way you use fonts, and we talked about this in the last project as well, we use fonts to create that kind of effect. Consider that when you're designing your own logo for yourself. Here's another example of a font that was designed specifically to solve a graphical logo problem, and I believe this also ended up being a font. Notice that in this case here, the D serves double duty, right? You don't even see that right away. So your name may have an opportunity for some combination like that. So keep that kind of thing in mind. I don't know why I had this in here. It's a horrible logo, but everybody knows it. They make a great product, and so there you are. But it's there, I suppose, because they designed that font specifically for that particular name. Here's another one where they designed the font specifically for the name and added a graphical symbol, which is like a star and a 9. Oh, well, so clever. But notice how the letter forms and the graphical symbol are, they share a very common thickness and weight and attitude. So it holds together very nicely. Here's another example of, instead of using weight for change, use color for change, adding a graphical shape across the top. And then, of course, a little contrast in font like we talked about in the last one. This is a serif font here, a sans serif on the bottom. So there's some opportunity there for, doing something kind of clever with your name. Another example of simply adding a graphical shape and then a graphical symbol or a mark and then a font. And so, consider these kinds of things. Same sort of story here. They take the S, they sort of played around with it a little bit to adapt it to make it look more cool. Place the whole thing inside of a large graphical shape. You can see how something like that it would be relatively simple to do and pull off without a lot of grief. And then we've got the swatch. This font was designed for this logo. Very simple graphical shape stuck on at the end. So it, there's some opportunity here just to use simple shapes as elements that are around, above, next to, below your name. And of course the company we all know and love, and using graphical shapes to create a large letter form. Okay, so this is something you might consider too, whether the letter form is attached to the name or not. That's another issue, but just using graphical shapes to create something, if your name works that way, you might consider something like that. This is an example of something probably not to do. Okay, you just basically take a very simple, straightforward letter form, a font, put 3 letters together or however many they are, add some bizarre unrelated shape, and you're done with it. This is this would be like barely a C project. Okay, here's an example of maybe something you might not want to do. Again, there's a lot of elements here that are unrelated. We've got this weird sort of mountaintop thing, which I don't know if it's got something to do with the A or what. And then we've got this gradation of red shapes and a funny little red deal here, and we've got the font with the O, and then this audio below it, and it just doesn't work. It's very convoluted. The shapes aren't related. The spaces aren't related. It needs a lot of work. I put this in here for a couple of reasons. One, I wanted to show you how you might use an extreme bold or reversed out shape and then add graphical elements into that shape. This is a little gradation, of course. We also have an extreme size scenario here. Same font, same weight, but now size and value and color make the difference. So that's something you might consider as well. I wanted to show this to you because this is a page from what's known as a Graphic Standards Manual, And all logos that are within the corporate environment have a graphic standards manual. In other words, that color green is a very specific color green. It is not any other color but that color. This gray is a very specific color. You'll find specifications on how to use only one color, or if you have opportunities for values, how to do that. This is the minimum size, maximum size, where on a page it has to go, where it can't go, those kinds of things. I wanted to show you this, excuse me, because I wanted to show you how many different ways there are to explore one name. You got the Web Search Factory, and they're using symbols, they're using initials, they're using graphical shapes, they're using marks. This is 12 completely different variations on one theme. So I don't want to hear anybody saying, oh, I couldn't think of anything. There's always a million things to do. And just, Googling, logos on the internet will give you a million ideas. So the only limitation you have is your creativity here. So take note of this. And then I wanted to show you this one because this is a good example of once they've got something going, the variations that you might try that could, make the logo a little bit more effective. They're playing around with weight and color and, reversing the I, repeating the I, adding a little graphical shape. So these are all variations once the idea got fairly far along. These are, of course, one solution and this is another solution. But my point is that variations on just what to do with a funny little shape or where to put it or whatever. There's millions of options, and I expect you to explore those. Okay, and here this is an example of once you get down to a real fine refinement, some little teeny things that you could try to do that might make it even more effective. Changing the value, changing the color, putting a different, color here, a different value, all black, what seems to work better. So these are the very, very minor variations that you would be exploring once you got to step, the part 3 of the exercise. So that's an example of how you might think about approaching some concepts as you begin to design your logo. Okay?